All right, hello everyone. Welcome in. A little special presentation here. We're going here a little bit early. The SEC is going to announce its 2024 schedule slate at 7 o'clock on the SEC network. We thought why not do something different here? React to it live, have that ready to go, and see how this all sort of looks in terms of what Georgia's 2024, along with the rest of the league schedule, is going to look like. I'm joined here by Brandon Adams. I believe our colleague Mike Griffith is going to hop on and join us here as well. So, Brandon, I'm sure you've been following all the rumors, notes, and everything like that to follow along with. What are you sort of expecting here going into tonight?
So just a quick question before we get into the schedule stuff. How long have we been live? Because that's like
30 seconds.
Caught me off guard. So we're not off to a rousing start in terms of our schedule reveal show for the fact that we were apparently live and I didn't realize that. So I'm glad all I was doing was texting at that particular time as opposed to any other number of embarrassing things I guess I could have been doing. But no, I'm excited about this. I remember doing this back in 2020 when the pandemic schedule was revealed, and I enjoy it. You know, I kind of like the college football way of knowing who Georgia's going to play 12 years from now. I think that's kind of nice for the planning purposes. But I do get a little jealous of the NFL fans who get this every year. You know, here's who you're playing. Now, ironically, when NFL schedules release, we already know who the teams are playing. It's simply the dates that matter. We're not getting any of the dates for the SEC schedule here coming up in a couple of minutes. But it will be interesting to see the list of teams. At this point in time, so much of this has seemingly been reported, starting with Chip Brown, who said that Georgia's going to go to Texas. Then you had various reports, and Connor, you can help me out here with whoever may have had this first, about Georgia playing at Alabama in 2024. You know, we've heard Ole Miss kind of pop in here. It sounds like there's a chance that Georgia's third permanent opponent, if the SEC does eventually go to the 9-game slate, which I think a lot of power brokers think eventually it will, that'd be Kentucky. Sounds like they're going to be on here. Home game, I guess, against Auburn. You already knew that'd be happening because of the fact that Georgia in a 9-game world would play Auburn every year. Anything else substantial that's out there? I mean, I don't mind the leaks. I think that's fun. I don't think that lessens the anticipation of the show itself because there's still something fun about the confirmation of all of this. But at this point in time, you know, a huge portion of Georgia's schedule, I believe, has been leaked now.
Yeah, as far as I've been able to follow it, I believe 6 of the 8 opponents have at least in some way been announced or reported. It's, again, as you point out, widely believed that Kentucky is going to be another permanent opponent for Georgia and that's a team on their schedule. And then the sort of belief here has been that Mississippi State is going to be the final home team for Georgia in 2024. And I'm sure we'll get into it, but a home slate of Tennessee, Auburn, and Mississippi State. You know, even as someone who is not a diehard Georgia fan, when Alabama gets to host Georgia, when Texas gets to host Georgia, it doesn't exactly light the world on fire. Yeah. That Mississippi State, Auburn, and Tennessee are the teams that are going to get to host at home that season, especially in you and I were talking about this morning. It's been 10 years since Georgia hosted LSU. Georgia, Texas A&M, which it has been reported by Texags that Georgia does not go to Texas A&M. I thought the whole reason we were doing this and changing the schedule and whatnot was to get those two teams to finally play in College Station. And I've long been someone that wants to see that game be put off as long as possible. It looks like the SEC agrees with that. If the Chip Brown report is end up being correct, Georgia will have played at Texas before it plays at Texas A&M as an SEC conference member. I have a lot of questions about this, which I'm sure will be answered and run full over the course of the next half hour, 45 minutes or so. But I have a lot of questions about the way Greg Sankey and company just decided to settle on this SEC schedule.
Sounds like Mike Griffith is here and going to join us. So let me make one statement, then we'll bring on Mike, let him kind of share some early thoughts here too before some of these schedules start rolling out. And my guess is they're going to roll through them here pretty quickly. I am not angry that Georgia's making a second consecutive trip to Tuscaloosa. The previous one was in 2020. That's a long time ago. That doesn't really mean a whole lot to me. But Georgia has had a long stretch now where it has not had a lot of marquee home games. Now, there are some games that have proven to be better in real life than they appear to be on paper. The fact that when you're contriving a schedule sort of made for TV for 1 year and Georgia still isn't getting the delivered home game here like Alabama would have been, that's the part that bothers me is Georgia has just played such a uninspiring home schedule. All due respect to Auburn, who year 2 of Hugh Freeze actually might not be too bad. You know, Tennessee, in all likelihood, at least they have a better chance than not of being a top 25 team.
Frankly, and that was an electric game in Athens a season ago.
That's right. That's right. So with due respect here, it's not the same thing as what a Alabama or a first time ever for Texas would be. That's the part that disappoints me. So, Mike, we're getting going here. The no official release yet from the SEC. They're basically just sort of explaining right now the formula for how this was decided. How about an early thought from you before some of this stuff starts rolling in here in a minute?
Yeah, Brandon, I think you nailed it. The home schedule has been a problem. We know the Jacksonville game can be the designated home game every other year at Florida, but at the same time, you'd like to see some more games that are more relevant in Sanford Stadium. I mean, that's been a problem, as is my hat with this background. So let me just swap this out here. There it is, Brandon. You've been waiting for it. Go ahead, say it.
Ty Cobb.
The Ty Cobb look comes out tonight for the podcast, but no, I think you're right. And the problem for me is that Georgia's put $240 million into their facilities. And to me, Sanford Stadium is as good of a game day as there is anywhere. And it's just sad to me that we don't see more elite games there, like the Notre Dame game, like the Tennessee game was last year. I'll be very curious to see if Georgia plays Tennessee or not. To me, that's a game I think if you're going to play at Alabama, you've got to drop one of your top teams. And we know it's not going to be Florida. And I think we already know that Georgia's going to have one of the more challenging schedules in 2024.
Yeah, Connor, along those lines, you and I talked about this before this afternoon, a little earlier today, in terms of what Georgia had dealt it compared to other SEC teams. I'm going to be very curious here in a couple of minutes, and maybe there's been some reporting on this already today. I've been kind of out of the loop. Maybe I've missed some of this. Is Alabama playing LSU? Because that's the complaint that Nick Saban had. Nick Saban did not want to play, and we're getting some of this kind of rolling in here a little bit. So they're just kind of highlighting some of these rivalry games. Alabama playing Tennessee, Florida playing Georgia, Auburn playing Georgia. We knew there'd be respect paid to some of these traditional rivalries. So that's what the SEC is kind of revealing here right now. But I'm going to be very interested to see, does Alabama play LSU? Because if they don't, for the first time in quite some time here, that's been a very notable SEC game. And it certainly looks like the SEC listened to Nick Saban's complaints, and the appearance is going to be they gave him what he wanted.
Right, and they just announced Georgia is going to host Auburn in the 2024 season. I think that had all been sort of expected, not a lot of surprise there as far as the way it goes. And so, yeah, look, I mean, I'll get directly into it. Nick Saban's getting up there in age. He's not going to be around the SEC much longer. And if, Georgia going to Tuscaloosa, they don't play at LSU, it feels a little bit to me maybe like, Nick Saban was calling him some favors and saying, I'm getting ready to cash in and head out, and I'd like a simpler schedule. They announced Oklahoma's schedule. Georgia is not on that. So, and we had been told that Georgia is at least going to play one of Oklahoma or Texas. That means Georgia very much playing Texas. We'll find out shortly the location of that game. But I think very clearly you see here, Nick Saban still has some power in this league, and he's not afraid to throw it around.
So we're finding out here, Oklahoma will host Alabama in 2024. So Alabama will have a road game at Oklahoma. Everybody in the league is going to play one or the other. They also get a chance to host Tennessee. How about going on the road to both Auburn and LSU? The Big 8 rivalry with Missouri preserved there as well. So welcome to the SEC, Oklahoma. That's interesting. That's a hefty schedule for the Sooners.
Interesting to note, Oklahoma does not play a game east of the Mississippi River in the SEC since joining, because their other road game, Missouri, as well, a very much Western SEC West feel. Here we go. They're announcing Texas right now.
Yeah, so the obviously Oklahoma-Texas game will remain a neutral site. Mike, you want to jump in here with a thought on what we've seen so far as this Texas schedule is released? By the way, Texas A&M returns, and A&M does get to host that. That's what Aggies fans said they wanted, as basically a deference for having been in the league longer. A&M will host Texas. First time these two teams play since 2011, and the game will be in College Station.
Yeah, I kind of feel like there's going to be some SC teams getting lost in the shuffle here. I mean, who wants to play Mississippi State or South Carolina or Kentucky? Oh, by the way, and of course, Vanderbilt, everybody's favorite road trip to Nashville.
Georgia at Texas, by the way, is confirmed. Once again, we don't know dates. We're just seeing the list of opponents. But the first leak that we had, somewhat late last night, Georgia, Texas, Connor is now confirmed.
Yeah, and Texas also draws Florida there as well. So a pretty nice little home stretch there. If you're Texas, you get those two big games. You do have to go to A&M, but I believe I did not see Alabama on there. I did not see LSU on there. I think that's a very safe sort of landing. You get Florida and you get Georgia at home. You get Oklahoma as a neutral site road game year one. That feels like a very safe landing spot for Texas. And I do, and again, conspiracy cap on, find it interesting that they're going first with Oklahoma and Texas as opposed to, say, the most recent SEC champions, alphabetical order. It is at least very interesting that Texas and Alabama are the first two teams that get announced here on this special.
Connor, I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, obviously there is some interest in who Texas and Oklahoma are going to be playing because this is their first time in the SEC. But it's certainly a very, there's a lot of pomp and circumstance to this rollout here, and you can't help but notice that. And I think you're bringing up a good point. By the way, G. Grace, resident Alabama fan, says he thinks that Texas has got a favorable schedule. Connor, it sort of sounds like you think the same thing there. There are a lot of rivalry games in that schedule. Texas, Arkansas is a very big rivalry, long time history there. That's a road trip for Texas. They frankly have a habit of losing in Fayetteville. So that's there. Oklahoma, of course, the neutral site game, and then at Texas A&M. But you're not seeing the Alabamas and the LSUs there on that schedule, as you pointed out.
No, in terms of traditional powers, the fact that you get Georgia at home there, I think is a big win. And so, if you're Texas, again, that's going to be, potentially Arch Manning's first season there, quarterbacking in Austin, though. I would not be surprised at all if Malik Murphy is actually the guy that ends up being a quarterback there for Texas, assuming things move on there. They're showing right now highlights from the last visit to College Station between Texas and Texas A&M was the last time that rivalry was played. So, I'm sure Texas fans will point out that, hey, they didn't get everything they wanted. But again, no Arkansas, no LSU, no Alabama, no LSU, no Auburn on there. I would say traditionally over the past 5 or 6, 7 years, those have been the best teams in the SEC. And they get Georgia at home and they don't really draw any of the traditional West powers.
And Mike, let me bring you back in here. You can say whatever you want to, but I think one thing I did want to respond to as well is a year from now, Connor's also kind of alluding to something I think is important, that who's good now and who's good, by this time of year, that has a tendency to change a little bit. As I said before, it's going to be year 2 for Hugh Freeze. I think better to play him now than Hugh Freeze's second year when he's had a chance to kind of work that transfer portal to his benefit a little bit more. I would say, and I'm not trying to be snarky here, but a team like Alabama that looks like a playoff contender right now, let's see how many games they lose this year. There's a chance the feel of playing Alabama is a little bit different in 2024 than it is in 2023. And, does a team like LSU sort of join Georgia as, that's the team you really want to try to avoid if you possibly can? I'm just speculating here, but any of that's possible. The league's going to feel different 12 months from now, Mike, in other words, because it always does.
Yeah, I would agree, especially as fluid as things are right now with the transfer portal, NIL deals. And I guess one of the observations that I had was Texas leaking the news that they would play Georgia. Texas was really resented in the Big 12 for years because the league catered to them. They also had that unequal revenue sharing plan for years and years and years with Texas and Oklahoma. So Texas, a school that is accustomed to throwing itself around, its weight around. Consider Florida on steroids. You know how Florida likes to throw their weight around in the SEC with the size of their media market. It seemed like at times Florida caught a break. The 2020 schedule, Florida was in rotation to play Alabama. Somehow Georgia ended up with that game. And what do you know? Florida's in the SEC title game. I do expect that Texas will wield a lot of power. It's a big money institution. It's in a giant market. It's a market that the SEC needs to capitalize on to make their television contract more valuable. And believe me, this caters for the television markets. This is in an effort to make the SEC more valuable so that they can have the same sort of revenue sharing that the Big Ten does, as the Big Ten has now cornered the top 3 media markets in the country with New York, New Jersey, Chicago, and Los Angeles, with the inclusion of USC and UCLA.
Connor, is it as straightforward as a lot of our commenters are saying that Oklahoma was clearly dealt a tougher schedule than Texas was? Oklahoma's schedule doesn't include Georgia. Texas does. So maybe you pump the brakes on saying that. So quickly. But on paper, it looks like Oklahoma has the tougher balance of games. Is that correct?
I mean, side by side, Alabama at Auburn at LSU. I think those games are all, you do draw Georgia, but traditionally we've seen, those teams in Oklahoma's schedule be a little bit tougher. I will point out we are now 12 minutes in to the SEC network telecast. You know how many SEC teams that are going to be in the SEC this year have had their schedule revealed so far?
Yeah, 0. You're right about this, Connor. You nailed this a couple of minutes ago. I think you're right. I think this is silly. Listen, Oklahoma and Texas coming to the SEC. That's the whole reason we're doing all of this. But the idea you're going to spend 15 minutes talking to just them, is that Joe Castiglione they're interviewing? Who is that?
That is Dusty Dvorak, I believe, in Oklahoma alone.
I mean, honestly, this is a little bit pathetic. I kind of agree with you here. I don't like the way this is rolling out at all. And, bringing in some guy from satellite radio to interview here seems a little silly too. I'm not a fan of any of this. And Connor, you absolutely picked this out. Way too much interest here in Texas and Oklahoma, two teams that are likely no better than middle of the pack in the SEC here in 2024.
Right. So they start with Oklahoma, Texas. I'll set the over-under. Are there 5 teams that hear their schedule before Georgia does? Like, where is Georgia? This is way too inside baseball. I'm interested. Where does Georgia end up in this sort of pecking order when it comes to when we hear their schedule? Because they are the defending champions in this conference, and they are the 2-time defending national champion. And so, maybe they go alphabetical order after this, big matchups, whatever. I'm curious when we ultimately decide to hear Georgia. It looks like we're getting ready to hear Alabama. So maybe that's alphabetical, but I mean, look, if you're a Georgia fan, you have your conspiracy cap on. You bring in Texas and Oklahoma, 2 not real SEC powers, and then who do you transition to? But Alabama.
Listen, I don't like it. I don't like it at all because it seems like now we're shifting to Alabama. You better be doing these in alphabetical order the rest of the way because otherwise.
If I don't see Auburn next, I'm going to have some questions.
So the Georgia-Alabama game is confirmed. Alabama also gets Missouri-South Carolina at home in 2024 as well as Auburn. They will play LSU. I question that. Would they play LSU? So the 3 permanent opponents that Alabama's supposed to play if the league goes to 9, they will also play them in 2024. They have road games, LSU, Oklahoma, and Tennessee. And for a team that hasn't covered the spread on the road since my children were toddlers, that is a very, very, very interesting slate of road games. They also get the bone thrown to go to Vanderbilt. But at LSU, at Oklahoma, at Tennessee, good luck to the tie with that slate of road games.
And they've already moved on. They've already moved on to Arkansas. Clearly, they blew their wad on Texas and Oklahoma there.
This is sloppy TV. It really is. I'm not saying we're winning an Emmy for this streaming video product, but this is sloppy TV. So Arkansas, they keep the battle line. No, the Golden Boot rivalry against LSU. They get the home game against Ole Miss, Tennessee, and Texas. That Texas game is a very big deal there in Fayetteville. Mm-hmm. That's the game Arkansas would rather win more than any other right now. They're going to go to Auburn, go to Mississippi State. Gosh, this is the easiest schedule in the world. My gosh.
Sam Pittman, and look, Arkansas's had a tough schedule of late in some years, with what they've had to do. At last, they get a little bit of a favorable schedule there with the way the home and road splits.
Also, that Arkansas, they're just rolling right to Auburn now. This is just sloppy TV.
Yeah.
I'm telling you right now, this is your media partner right here. This is ABC, ESPN, family of networks right here. This is sloppy. Mike, as they're announcing the Auburn schedule, you want to jump in here on anything?
Yeah, I guess the thing that I just underscore, coming out of the spring meetings in Destin was Kirby's attitude about this was, look, you're going to play everybody in the league over the course of 2 years. Kirby wasn't sweating it. Kirby called it an overrated conversation. He talked more instead about the importance and the timing of when these playoff games are going to be, things that are relevant, things that really could hurt the SEC. Tonight it's a lot of pomp and circumstance and hype, as you guys noted, for Texas and Oklahoma. And listen, I'm here for it. Because Texas, when you talk about overrated, right, it starts with Texas. I think, what do they win? 3 conference championships in the Big 12 in their 27 or 30 years in that league. What 110 wins? They won 10 games since they beat Georgia when Georgia went there downtrodden and missing their best player after the Oklahoma AD and the Ohio State AD and the Florida AD and the Georgia Tech AD loaded up on them. These men of great integrity who, by the way, stabbed their league members in the back to make the backdoor deal to get into the league. So believe me, I want the front row seat to see what happens to Texas and Oklahoma. Texas, by the way, did not score an offensive touchdown at home against TCU with a great top 10 running back picked by never mind. So I'm here for it. I want to see what happens for these teams now that they're in a real league of depth and their fans might be ticking the wins off in their mind. Things will be very different in October and November for the fans of Texas and Oklahoma.
So am I wrong here for saying that for Georgia fans who are on guard to say, the SEC gave us a sour deal in terms of the schedule, based on that schedule for Alabama, it's going to be hard for Georgia fans to cry foul about who they have to play. That is not a soft schedule for Alabama. That's a pretty tough schedule for Alabama. So we're going to see Georgia playing certainly a tough schedule here, but it's based on what I'm seeing there for the Crimson Tide. you're not going to be able to say that Georgia is unfairly dealt a tough hand, because that schedule for Alabama ain't easy. That's a 9-3 for Alabama right there if I ever saw one.
I think I'll be interested to see as this unfolds. In the sense I've kind of gotten so far is they want as many big matchup games as you want, which makes sense from a TV standpoint. But I start to wonder, and America's getting rid of the middle class left and right here. I wonder if there's a team in the SEC that's in sort of that middle class range that, because they're very clearly loading up the top end programs to play against one another. We made the remark about Arkansas earlier, and it seems like they sort of have a favorable schedule. If there's a team there in that sort of middle class tier, can they sort of rise up because all those top programs?
Connor, who are they? Call them out. Is it Kentucky? Is it Arkansas?
Mike, I think Connor's bringing up a good point. You got to see the schedule first. But I said this in our cool down today as well on DawgNation Daily, the point that Connor's making, that if they're putting all the good teams together, that means some of the lesser teams, someone's going to get an easy schedule. If that team could then go transfer portal palooza crazy, that could be a very interesting sort of pairing there. And I think that's the point that Connor's kind of making.
How about A&M, Ole Miss? Ole Miss and Kentucky are the two teams to me that stand out as middle class, that have slipped up there at times in the top 20, and then they end up getting exposed, right?
Yeah, I think Kentucky's going to be an interesting example. By all accounts, it sounds like they're going to have to go play Georgia now, but that will be a home game there. And Kirby Smart has still not lost there. And unfortunately, at the 18-minute mark, we have our first commercial. They have not announced Georgia's schedule yet. So, again, just, Georgia's your main draw right now, and you're relegating them to second block status. It's very interesting the way this is sort of all unfolded here. I did not expect to be the chief conspiracy person here with BA on, but it's sort of the way that it's unfolding. It's certainly very interesting to sort of see the way this is drawn out so far. I would say, I do think that, Texas and Oklahoma have, I would say, fairly tough schedules. Alabama, that road slate plus hosting Georgia, who beat them the last time they played. And so it's interesting. They have 4, I would say, really marquee games there. These big time programs we spend most time talking about, not even we from a DawgNation standpoint, but from a national standpoint, those programs have had the toughest schedule so far as seeing them.
Is anybody not, and I apologize for not knowing this, but I mean, certainly Alabama is, but is anybody not playing their anticipated 3 permanent opponents right now? Because A, that's a tip that this league wants to go to a 9-game conference schedule, believes that maybe has a chance to. But B, that also kind of explains some of the schedule logic here. To my knowledge, no one thus far has failed to have been given what we anticipate their 3 permanent opponents are going to be.
No, I saw Arkansas had Texas, they had LSU, they had Missouri, so you would think that box is checked there. Auburn had Georgia and Alabama, and I believe they had LSU at home, and I believe those would have been talked about as their potential 3 marquee matchups there. So far, the inclination we've got is that you've gotten teams to hit their 3. And again, I do think that they want to get to 9. When that ultimately ends up happening, I'm going to continue to be skeptical of that, because I don't believe ESPN is going to give more money to the league to do so. And so, look, it's going to become, does the SEC want to put forth a better, product for fans or consumers, or do they want to continue to protect teams and go with an 8-game schedule?
Well, now, wait a minute. Let me interject something here, BA. And Connor's point is well made in the sense of, yes, 9 conference games sounds better than 8. However, it comes with a caveat. Nick Saban said if they go to 9 games, they're going to drop one of these future years home and home series. Like, for example, I think there's a year where Georgia doubles up, I want to say, with UCLA and Louisville, perhaps. There's a year I think they play maybe Clemson and Oklahoma. Would you want the extra conference game, and it wouldn't be Oklahoma anymore, but forgive me because I don't have that future schedule in front of me, but would you want the extra conference game over an extra non-conference like a Florida State, like a UCLA? That to me is where the SEC had scheduled aggressively, thinking that this 8-game schedule was going to go far into the future. And it looks like you're ready to weigh in.
I'm going to let Connor weigh in. I'm just saying it's a fair question. I think I know the direction we're going on this, but I do think that's a fair question. It's one that, I've debated with a lot of Georgia fans in the past. But Connor, go ahead.
Mike, you've covered the SEC almost as long as I have been alive.
Thank you.
Why would we want to see less SEC games? And that's just sort of my general, that's sort of my belief. Look, like Georgia, Louisville, cool. I'd rather see Georgia play Texas more frequently.
But it's also Georgia, Florida State. I mean, it's not just Georgia, Louisville. It's Georgia, Florida State.
Well, for all practical intents, and Connor
they're announcing Florida's schedule right now.
Connor raises a good question. The answer is because of the strength of the SEC championship game, which is so much more powerful than these other leagues. I feel like the SEC beats themselves up. I want to avoid the rematch that we're inevitably going to get in the Big Ten. Brandon, you have some news there up here.
Well, I'm pointing out that Florida is going to host Texas A&M in 2024, which will be at least the fourth time
they've played each other.
Has played Texas A&M, and Georgia has still only played them once, and I think we're anticipating we'll not play them in 2024 either. So there you go on that. Florida will also in 2024 keep the game against LSU, which is not a rivalry, but it is a game that they have had for quite some time. Now we're getting to Georgia. It's what we had been hearing. It's Auburn at home, Mississippi State at home, Tennessee at home, and then the road games, Alabama, Kentucky. Georgia will go to Ole Miss for the first time since 2016, and also the road game against Texas. So I don't see anything here that had not been widely reported. And once you start doing the kind of algebraic equation here, it's pretty obvious who Georgia was going to be playing anyway. But those are the games here. Neutral Florida, home against Auburn, Mississippi State, Tennessee, away game against Alabama, Kentucky, Ole Miss, and Texas. Mike, what you think about that?
I mean, it's like you said, it's what we expected. And Kirby shrugs, right? Kirby shrugs and says, bring them on. You're going to play everybody every 2 years anyway. I'm a little surprised at the Alabama game. I did correctly project the Ole Miss game. That's a return game from this year. Little surprised by Mississippi State. We just saw them a few years ago. Disappointed there's no Texas A&M road game in here. I mean, this is something that, the Georgia fans, they want to go there. The whole point of, this 1-7 or 3-6, whichever one, was to get the teams to circulate. And A&M's been in the league since 2012, and Georgia still has not been to College Station, which, by the way, will be a disappointment, but probably still on your bucket list.
Yeah, at this point in time, I sort of hope Georgia never plays at Texas A&M. Just keep the joke going here. And Connor, to reiterate what I said before, my only beef is for a schedule that you're essentially manipulating however you want to, once again, it's really nothing but the teams that we've kind of gotten used to seeing Georgia play at home. Georgia-Auburn could be a huge game by 2024. Georgia-Tennessee, as you pointed out, this year was the biggest home game in the history of the stadium. So those could be monumental games. But it feels like a lot of what we've seen before, when the whole point of the night is, hey, here's a bunch of stuff that you've never seen before. Well, Georgia's home slate in 2024 could have been any year's home slate.
BA, you're talking a lot about Hugh Freeze the way you used to talk about Jimbo Fisher. And I'm a little worried the way you speak of him, just given, what that rivalry means. Obviously, there's been some talk of that going away if they remain in an 8-game schedule on an annual basis. I'd like to see Auburn do well. I'd like to see that game continue to matter. And if you're comparing him to the way you used to compare Jimbo Fisher, I am a little concerned there. As far as Georgia's schedule at large, look, I mean, so far it's been in line with what we've seen other power programs in this league sort of have. There are no easy weeks ever, but there are certainly enough games on there to where, unlike, say, the 2023 season, you can't just say that they're going to go 12-0 and not really think about it. There are going to be games, maybe even multiple games that they lose on their schedule. Let's not forget, they also play Clemson to open next year in Atlanta. I know Mike is a big fan of Brent Key. Maybe Georgia Tech gets a little bit closer to respectability now. Having said all that, if Georgia goes 10-2 against that schedule, they're getting into the playoff. They may even, find themselves playing for an SEC championship there. They're going to be, at least on paper, as talented as every team they're going to see in their schedule. And with what we've seen against Kirby Smart, I'm not going to bet against that. It's obviously going to take some adjustment. And I think given next year is also the first year of the 12-team playoff and the newness of it, it'll be interesting to see how we all sort of react to, the way that it goes out. But Georgia's going to play a tougher schedule going forward. I think most fans would be okay with that, given, while, yes, next year you do have to go to Alabama, you do have to go to Texas. That's probably a pretty crummy luck of the draw right there. In future years, who knows? Maybe you get LSU to come back to Athens for the first time since 2013, and then you get to host Oklahoma that same season. And so I do think eventually this is all going to sort of work itself out there.
If Georgia were to go to Alabama this year to be a relatively narrow favorite, my hunch is by next year, Georgia's about a touchdown favorite on the road against Alabama. I'm guessing they'll be about a touchdown favorite on the road against Texas. So from that standpoint, it's a tougher schedule on paper for 2024 than it is right now. But I don't see anybody else in the Georgia schedule that I think is obvious to be less than a double-digit underdog to Georgia. The presence of the extra road game means you'll look tougher on paper than this year's schedule does, where Georgia's slightly more than a touchdown favorite on the road at Tennessee. To me, Texas and Alabama next year feel like similar games in terms of how the odds makers are likely to view them. But Georgia's still going to be a double-digit favorite, at least 10 of its 12 games in 2024. For all the sort of histrionics around all of this, I mean, I see a schedule. Clemson I'm with reserve judgment on, I guess. But in terms of the SEC slate here, of the 8 games Georgia plays, it's going to be a double-digit favorite in 6 of those 8 games.
I would agree with that there. Look, again, Georgia's operating in a place now where, and I do think that even when we get to, these tougher schedules, they're still going to be far and away, better handle for that. And I'll say this about Texas and Oklahoma. I'll be interested in seeing how they handle the week in, week out physicality that comes with playing in this league. Look, and not to disrespect teams like Baylor, TCU, who we saw get to a national championship this season. It's going to be a different beast for Texas and Oklahoma. While I think Steve Sarkisian has done a good job in terms of recruiting and trying to build his team in a way that can handle an SEC, I do think it's going to be an adjustment for both of those programs in terms of coming into this league and expecting to play and compete at that level on a week in, week out basis.
Mike, the Tennessee schedule revealed here. Let me ask you 2 questions about this. We saw Tennessee, Oklahoma not that long ago. These 2 teams have played a home and home within the last however many years. From that standpoint, wouldn't it have been more interesting to pair Tennessee and Texas, given the fact that I don't think we've ever seen that, unless I'm forgetting something obvious here? And then I'm curious, do Vols fans, are they complaining about the fact that they have Georgia on the 2024 schedule, given the fact that they're supposed to be losing Georgia and, this is supposed to be about kind of getting rid of the SEC East, and therefore, but for now, this SEC East game, at least SEC East historic traditional game is going to stay on their schedule. How do you think Vols fans feel about keeping Georgia when over the course of the long haul, they're not going to be doing that on a yearly basis anymore?
Yeah, it's probably not real convenient. Any trip to Sanford Stadium is a tough one, and certainly they got to play the Dogs at home this year. And last year's game was just one of the best I've seen in regular season. So I think there's probably a lot of mixed feelings, right? On the one hand, you like to see your team play these competitive games, as Connor pointed out, but not too competitive. You want to be able to navigate that schedule and play for championships. And you look at you look at Tennessee, and you see at home of course, they're going to keep Florida, and they're going to keep Alabama. And then you got road trips to Georgia and Oklahoma. I don't know how scary Oklahoma is anymore, to be honest with you. That was quite a drop-off last year. I wasn't very impressed with Oklahoma football last year, and I'm not sure they're going to get back to the level that they were at anytime soon.
I'd keep my eye on Jackson Arnold at quarterback, though. I think there's a chance that
I like him a lot.
If he's not very, very good, then Brent Venables could be in some real trouble, especially coming into the SEC next year. There's a chance Jackson Arnold is really, really good. And to circle back to what we were saying a moment ago, they just released the Vanderbilt schedule. If you want to reiterate what looks to be a fairly favorable Texas schedule, at least as favorable as it can be, one of Texas' road games is at Vanderbilt. So if you want to really kind of hammer home the point here that Texas fans thus far have had very little to complain about, one of your small handful of road games, I guess only 3 road games for Texas, just given the neutral site game against Oklahoma, one of those being at Vanderbilt. Boy, living right in Austin here right now.
I mean, Mike, I know how you feel about Texas. BA, I'll ask you the blunt question. Did Texas sort of get preferential treatment with it joining the league and the schedule that it has been given, and part of this, like Oklahoma counting as a road game for them, that just sort of, it lucked out that was the year that it weighed out.
And I could have been wrong about that. It may not be counted as a road game. I should.
No, it was. They were counting Oklahoma that year as a road game.
So I'm going to stop short of saying it's an obvious travesty, because any schedule that includes Georgia can't be that easy, right? So from that standpoint, Texas has to play Georgia. They get the game at home, but Georgia fans aren't sweating the idea of traveling to Austin. I think they're actually looking forward to it. And as Mike has pointed out, Kirby Smart's attitude about this is certainly not going to be, backing down from any kind of competition here on that. So the only thing I'm kind of prepared to say is certainly Texas fans have nothing to complain about. Now, some of their fans will probably complain about going to College Station, because the last time they played back in 2011, the game was also in College Station, but nobody wants to hear that here right now. So I don't think they had necessarily an intentionally soft schedule given to them. But of all of the teams, we're kind of in the upper half of the SEC. Someone's schedule is bound to be a little easier than the others. And in this particular case, it sort of looks like it's going to end up being Texas.
BA, one question for you. So Georgia's home games next season in the 2024 from an SEC slate standpoint. Unfortunately, Georgia, Florida next year count as an SEC home game, so you really only get 3 of them. Home against Auburn, home against Tennessee, home against Mississippi State. Are you glad, specifically with regards to Auburn and Tennessee? I think, Georgia fans will be whatever about the Mississippi State game. That'll probably be homecoming, quite frankly. Are you glad that you got to see those 2 teams that at least Georgia does have a recent history with? And fans, I would encourage you to weigh in on this as well. I'm just generally curious. Or would you have rather seen an Oklahoma come here, an LSU team that has not come here for a long time, a Texas A&M team that has been here less recently than Mississippi State was? Do you like that you were seeing the teams that Georgia has played frequently, seen on their schedule on an annual basis in Tennessee and Auburn standpoint? Or would you have rather, with Georgia's home schedule, even if it necessarily means playing what would have been a far tougher schedule, would you have rather seen those two, a difference there?
It's a great question. I feel very differently about Auburn compared to Tennessee. Georgia-Auburn is a game you have to have on the schedule, I believe. It's one of the main reasons why I want the league to go to the 9-game slate. Georgia-Auburn, I believe, needs to be played every year. So while it's not that exciting to play Auburn at home because that's something that Georgia does, it's also, I believe, something that Georgia needs to do. So I'm very glad to see that there. The Tennessee game, I would have much rather see Oklahoma there. Now, they're not playing. No team in the SEC is playing both Texas and Oklahoma, so this is not possible just given the constraints of the schedule. But to answer your question, a team other than Tennessee, I believe, would have been more interesting. And by the way, we have no idea. This is the point I keep trying to make. A year from now, your guess is as good as mine about who's better between Tennessee and Oklahoma. Right now, Tennessee appears to be better on paper, but a lot can change over the course of a year.
We wouldn't have said that a year ago.
That's exactly right. We simply don't know. So it literally is 6 of one, half a dozen of another in terms of which team you would say is going to be better. But I do believe that Georgia fans would have been more excited about hosting Oklahoma in 2024 than they would have been about hosting Tennessee. So from that standpoint, I'm only so excited about the Tennessee game. Now, look, if Tennessee is able to match some this year what it did a year ago, it's ironic there'll be a lot more juice in Georgia-Tennessee. We've played these 2 teams a long time with the game really meaning nothing. It'd be interesting to think, well, now that Tennessee is actually finally relevant again, Georgia's about to stop playing them at some point in time on a yearly basis. But my guess is they're going to settle somewhere around the middle of the bottom of the top 25, and playing them is not going to be much of a bigger deal than it is, really kind of playing anybody else. So long answer to a short question, I would have preferred Oklahoma over Tennessee, but obviously the league's not making that kind of concession, giving you both the new teams here right now.
I would like to have seen LSU in Sanford Stadium. I believe it's 2014 since 2013 since the Bayou Bengals have been here. That would have been a nice game to see instead of maybe Tennessee or Oklahoma. Of course, you feel more affinity for the Auburn rivalry. I've covered Auburn. I've covered Tennessee. I've seen the Georgia rivalry from both sides. Tennessee puts a lot more into it than Auburn. Auburn is pretty much spent on Bama, and with good results, I might add. I just never felt the same fire for Auburn and Georgia that I did when Tennessee, Georgia played. It seemed like that those were 2 teams that knocked one another out. It was a throw the records out kind of rivalry. Some dynamic happenings in Neyland Stadium in Sanford. I believe that was the last time maybe the only time that the field was stormed in Sanford Stadium history. So at least recent history that according to the historians. So but I do know that the Deep South's oldest rivalry has that connection. Goes back, obviously, with Coach Dooley being an Auburn man and Pat Dye being a Georgia man. A lot of the forefathers enjoyed that. A lot of the same people that enjoy the Georgia Tech rivalry, Connor, enjoy the Auburn rivalry as much.
Yeah, I think you're completely wrong about this, by the way. I mean, you're certainly free to have whatever opinion you want to have. I think you're completely short-selling what I think has been an incredibly intense rivalry between Georgia and Auburn, especially recent years. Now, it's taken a turn for the worse from a rivalry standpoint lately because Georgia's been so dominant. But I think you're underselling what the Georgia-Auburn rivalry has been.
Well, I guess I just think about, some of the meetings that they've had and what's been on the line and some of the upsets. I remember Most notably, Tennessee was on the verge of taking over the East when Steve Spurrier retired. Everyone assumed that Tennessee was going to ascend to that position because they'd beaten Steve Spurrier in his final home game. And Mark Richt came in with David Green and David Pollock, and Georgia really turned him back. And then there were some times that Tennessee beat really good Georgia teams. I think about the Hail Mary between the hedges, and somehow Butch Jones beats Kirby Smart, which was crazy. And Kirby has just laid it to Tennessee every year since. Whereas Auburn just, Gus had the 1 year, 2017 regular season, pulled kind of a left-handed upset, and the game just hasn't really seemed real competitive since.
So I'd just say Tennessee and Auburn have beaten Kirby Smart the same amount of times since Kirby got here. From a win-loss perspective, it's been pretty similar.
Yeah, last year was a 1-1. I haven't seen that from Auburn in a while.
So couple things that jump out to me, and we can decide how much longer we want to go in terms of how many SEC teams we want to, how much more we want to see revealed here. But one of the things I kind of mentioned today that Georgia fans are going to have to get used to is the average distance of travel is going to go up on a yearly basis now because the epicenter geographically of this league is just kind of moving to the west here a little bit. So Austin's obviously a long trip. That's essentially a plane trip. Kentucky, you can drive it. I usually do. But it is, 6-7 hour type drive here. You're a couple hours north of Knoxville to get to Lexington. That's one of the longer trips that Georgia traditionally takes. A lot of people don't realize is that Ole Miss is not super close to here. Mississippi State's just a short, 4-hour drive, something like that.
Yep.
It doesn't take very long to get to Starkville. But Ole Miss is essentially in Memphis. That's a good little ways here.
It's faster because I did this in January for a friend's wedding. It's faster to get from Athens to Oxford by flying out of Atlanta into Memphis and then driving the 45 minutes south into Oxford. That's just from a time perspective, that was just how it worked out. So I think BA is largely right here. It is going to be harder if you're someone who is fortunate enough to go to all these Georgia road games, along with the fact that they're in Jacksonville and they get a neutral site game in Atlanta that year. It is sort of shaping up that way that travel is going to be a much bigger burden.
Yeah, just in some form or fashion, this is what it's going to look like every single year. I'm not very good at math, but if I did the sort of, average distance travel for these Georgia road games, my guess is 2024, it's probably higher than we've seen it in most years. And I'm including those years in which Georgia goes to Missouri every other year.
Are you counting the Georgia home game against Florida too? Because that's another 5.5 hours or 6 hours, I suppose.
Yeah, but that's something that Georgia's been doing for a while. I'm just talking about in terms of what you're going to get used to doing here on a regular basis this is just a bigger league now. I mean, bigger from a geographic footprint. And Greg Sankey has bragged about, well, listen, all we did was add blah, blah, blah miles by bringing in Texas and Oklahoma, essentially bringing in border states to what the SEC kind of already had, or in the case of Texas, a state that it already shared. It's not Los Angeles for USC, UCLA, but for Georgia fans who travel to a lot of games, I know plenty of Georgia fans who do, this new SEC is going to feel different. Ole Miss is not an easy short road trip. And obviously Austin's way out there, and keeping Kentucky as a permanent opponent is going to feel a lot longer than going to either Tennessee or South Carolina, which are much shorter trips. Georgia's going to be doing a lot of traveling here in the future. Everybody in the SEC is going to, but Georgia fans are going to kind of feel it. How
do you feel about Georgia going to Alabama again when they were just there in 2020? Instead of Alabama coming to Sanford Stadium?
So what I said, Mike, about that a little earlier is that it doesn't bother me so much that it's 2 straight trips for Georgia to Alabama, because you're talking about a good number of years in between on that. What bothers me is that Georgia's kind of getting a home slate that's very similar to what we're used to seeing it play before, where this was a chance to kind of give Georgia something it hasn't had. And for everything you want to say, well, Georgia hasn't hosted LSU since 2013. They haven't hosted Alabama since 2015. Now, as one of our commenters mentioned, that was also an embarrassing day, kind of the last year prior to Kirby Smart getting here. But putting that aside, it's actually been a pretty long time since Georgia has hosted Alabama in Athens. And so from that standpoint, I'm not mad of 2 straight trips to Tuscaloosa, because the trip in 2020 wasn't even a full stadium anyway. I'm just sort of more mad that the SEC had a chance to give Georgia a home game that was, I don't want to say unique because that's the wrong use of word, but interesting in compared to what's had happened before, and they didn't do it. So that's my beef with the Alabama game. The fact that, you could have given Georgia something interesting. Instead, you essentially sort of rubber stamp what Georgia has been having.
So we talked earlier about, and we've talked about, again, marquee games. I think Georgia, Alabama absolutely falls into it. And I'm glad that's a game being played, because BA, I think you and I were texting about this earlier this offseason. when you were asking for bold predictions. I wasn't sure we were ever going to see another Georgia-Alabama game with Nick Saban in charge. And so I do think that this game being on the 2024 schedule guarantees it. We talked about how the top echelon teams are all playing each other, and I think therefore have a similarly difficult schedule. Alabama has to go to Oklahoma, LSU, and Tennessee. I do believe I have found the team that is in that sort of middle-class realm that has the schedule that sets up. I'm going to read you the teams that they play. Home games against LSU, Missouri, Texas, and Arkansas. Okay. Road games against Auburn, Florida, Mississippi State, and South Carolina. They do not play either Alabama or Georgia, who have traditionally been the two most talented teams in the country. I would say from a schedule standpoint, that is about as good as you are going to get. You don't play Oklahoma. You get Texas at home. You get an LSU team at home. That is as good as it's going to get. Unfortunately, the team that got that schedule was the Texas A&M Aggies, a team I don't think anyone here can trust. But that is a team where you look at a schedule like that. And again, going forward, I think one of the interesting things is going to be, do you avoid two of Georgia, Alabama, LSU, who are pretty clearly, at least going into the season, are the top programs in the country, at least in the conference, at least the three favorites to potentially win the SEC. Do you avoid at least two of those, and do you maybe get that third one at home? That's the way it worked out for Texas A&M. I think Texas and Texas A&M both come off as sort of winners with their schedule in terms of the way that this shook out for those teams.
No, I think that's a really interesting assessment, Connor. And that's exactly the kind of thing that, you got to have the roster to take advantage of that. But if there was ever a time to say, okay, we're going to do anything we can to put the right guys in this team. Now, in the case of, Jimbo Fisher, it's not obviously be able to coach them up if that, if he did have the favorable schedule and even the players to be able to do that with. But if there was ever a time to say, okay, we got dealt a hand that's not likely to be the case in the future, time to go all in and try and time to try to utilize the portal or something like that to your advantage here, because that is the kind of thing that does matter. And I guess I am kind of curious. I think about this from a Georgia standpoint of, Georgia gets Alabama, but not LSU. I wonder how many teams either got the pairing of both Alabama and LSU out of the SEC West, or the pairing of both Georgia and Alabama, the two teams that for the longest time now have been at the top of the SEC. I wonder how many teams got at least two of those three.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so, I don't know. Right. Yeah. I'm looking forward to diving into the schedule wide, and they're going to be people way smarter than me that do the proper analysis on this. But, I think going forward, again, to be clear, this is a one-off 2024 solution. The hope is that going forward in 2025, they have a better idea in terms of, what it is going to be on an annual basis. They're hoping that this is a one-year stopgap so that eventually they can get to 9 SEC games. And so I do think that is something important to note going forward, BA.
Interesting to note here, they're saying this on TV right now, LSU has got both UCLA and USC as non-conference games in 2024. Now, the USC games can be played in Las Vegas. Now, you talk about jealous. That, to me, is the type of thing. I mean, you talk about that.
LSU fans in Vegas, oh, boy.
Gosh, that's going to be so bonkers. So you've got LSU playing the neutral site game against USC, but I guess also playing the game against UCLA there as well, which – that's pretty interesting. And by the way, maybe a little bit of extra juice between LSU and UCLA, just given the comments that Ed Orgeron made, prior to that game, 2021 season, whenever that was.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Becomes hard to remember some of this kind of stuff. So interesting to see two, I guess Georgia's got two Power Fives as well, but Georgia doesn't really count. Interesting to see those two Power Five, teams on that LSU schedule, in addition to what they're going to play in the league.
Right, and they just went through Florida, and Florida will play, as Mike has sort of hinted at before, with if you go to a 9-game schedule and you do keep two Power Fives. Florida, even with an 8-game SEC schedule, they are set to play 11 Power 5 foes that year. They get Miami, they play Florida State on an annual basis, and now UCF has moved into the Big 12, so they are technically a Power 5 program there as well.
Good point. And they also hold on to LSU in 2024.
Yep.
That's not a rivalry, but it has been played as a permanent opponent, and they'll keep them there as well. Mike, something else, and like I said, y'all can decide how much longer y'all want to do this. Christy brought this up a minute ago, or at least she said something that made me think about this. The TV schedule next year is going to look different. CBS will be out on this in 2024. I haven't heard any reporting on this. Maybe SEC Media Days, they'll say something about this.
Surely.
Where ESPN/ABC/SEC Network, where they want to put the biggest game of the week. There's no more draft anymore. CBS doesn't get first pick on that. SEC slash ESPN slash ABC gets to put these games wherever they want to. Where will they put the biggest game in the SEC week after week? Will it still be at 3:30? Will they do more noon stuff to compete with Fox? Will they put the biggest SEC game each week at 8 p.m.? Because I continue to contend that one of the reasons why Georgia's had so few night games is Georgia's actually been good enough that they've been drafted prior to getting to the night game, which oftentimes is an SEC network game, which is, not quite the level that Georgia's playing at right now. Will we see more good games at night when the new TV contract takes shape in 2024? That's also something I'm very interested to see here.
Yeah, well, now that you have a couple more marketable teams, I don't want to necessarily say great teams because we don't know what Texas and Oklahoma are going to do yet, but I think you have room for, 12, 3:30, and 7. I really do. And, one point we haven't made, and some really smart scheduling by Georgia. I mean, yes, all of a sudden now playing a team like Clemson in your opener, that's kind of scary, especially if you look at how Clemson's recruiting, getting that outstanding linebacker right out of Georgia's backyard. I mean, that's tough. Dabo's not done yet. You do open with them, and yes, Georgia Tech, I do think is going to get better under Brent Key. They did outplay Georgia for one half. They got spanked in the end, but Georgia Tech fought in that game. But the two other non-conference games, which obviously they're yawners, people can complain about the home schedule, Tennessee Tech and UMass, but that November 23rd game, very strategically placed, because now we know how difficult that 2024 run is going to be. And at least Georgia will get somewhat of a breather against UMass on November 23rd before they play Georgia Tech at home on November 30th, which is usually a physical game, if not a close game. So I think the scheduling was good. The Clemson game, I don't think Georgia would have scheduled Clemson in an opener had they known what was coming down the pipe with Alabama also being on the schedule. I mean, it's just ridiculous to me. I don't even – the fact that Georgia and Alabama are playing to me is just stupefying when there's other teams that Georgia could have played. But the fact of the matter is that Georgia does have a couple of soft games on their schedule in 2024, and they're going to need those breathers because this is going to be a physical schedule. The next thing we haven't talked about, we won't know, BA, until they actually release the schedule. Strategically, when are those open dates? And again, I go back to 2019, 5 teams had an open date before they played Georgia. Georgia played 2 teams before an open date. They were at a -3, and one of those teams was South Carolina, and you better believe that played a factor in Will Muschamp's upset between the hedges.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, Connor, it'll be interesting to see where these games start getting placed. My assumption is they'll respect something in the neighborhood of Halloween for Georgia, Florida, I'm guessing. My thought is they'll respect third Saturday in October for Tennessee and Alabama. My guess is that Auburn's whining about not having to play Auburn and Alabama. So I should say Georgia and Alabama so close together. My guess is that'll be, respected again. My guess is that the games that have sort of a traditional spot, including like say Texas and Oklahoma playing first Saturday in October, it typically is right at the beginning of the month. My guess is they'll just sort of plug them in to where they typically have been. Some of these teams that have non-conference games are kind of already there, and they'll just start sort of jamming stuff in after that. Is that kind of the sense you get about how that's going to go?
Yeah, I'll be interested, especially with Tennessee being on the schedule. Is that a game where in, I believe, the last 2 or 3 seasons, it's been after the Florida game? Do they keep that there this year going forward? I think one thing in particular when it comes to Georgia's schedule, and this might be my final point here as we sort of wrap this up, how do you break up the Texas and Alabama games? I think on paper, those are the 2 toughest games given that they're going to be on the road in those circumstances. I'd like to see Tennessee do it another year. I'd like to see what Auburn looks like under Hugh Freeze year 1 there. How are those games broken up? Is there a game in September, given they're going to play Clemson that month? Is there a game, do they play both of them potentially after that Florida game? Are they sort of sandwiched around that where maybe you go to Texas because that's going to be, I believe, your longest road game in terms of travel distance, bye week, Florida at Alabama, and then probably Tennessee to end it, given that the way the schedule sets up with Georgia playing UMass the 23rd or the next to last week, and then Georgia Tech the week later there. I'll be interested in seeing going forward, okay, we've got the teams, we know these. As BA, I think, has rightly pointed out a couple of times, it's so hard to know year to year. No one would have said a year ago that Tennessee was a better program and headed in a better direction than Oklahoma. That's the way it sort of has broken out and seems pretty clear and obvious going forward here. So a lot of that is going to change. I think the big next domino to fall, and traditionally it's been in the month of either like September or October when we learn those potential future dates there. Don't start setting your wedding dates yet. Please just let this come out. out as far as when that is. What does specifically when it comes to Georgia, how is this schedule sort of broken up and balanced? Because if there's a stretch where Georgia, 3 out of 4 weeks, they're playing Texas, Florida, Alabama, that's pretty much going to come to define their season there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's how these games get clustered that's going to totally matter. And Mike, 2 quick points before we wrap up. One of these things that Connor brought up, I think, is a really good one. It was basically explained to me by people kind of closer to the epicenter of power in the SEC that the purpose of moving the Georgia-Tennessee game to late in the year was they wanted to replicate in the East what existed in the SEC West, where the division was essentially decided late. You had November game between Alabama and LSU, final game of the season between Auburn and Alabama. These late November games decided the division. The SEC East didn't really work out that way. A lot of the East teams have in-state rivals out of conference. Oftentimes you have a team like Georgia that sort of runs away with the deal. They kind of moved Georgia-Tennessee towards November as a way of trying to kind of replicate in the East what had existed in the SEC West. Well, now there is no more divisions anymore. So as it was explained to me, one of the reasons for putting Georgia-Tennessee the last couple of years where it's been, that's no longer necessary. So we could see Georgia-Tennessee move back near the beginning of the schedule the way it was for a long time. We could see it stay in November because there's nowhere else to put it. That's one of those games where your guess is as good as mine as to when that game actually gets played.
Well, we already pointed out currently they have UMass on the 23rd and Georgia Tech on the 30th. So we know that it won't be that late into the season. But another thing to consider was that Kirby and Auburn both had been wanting to switch Auburn and Georgia Tech, so they weren't both home and both away, and they needed the third dance partner, and that's what Philip Fulmer and Tennessee were. I'd also say this, the Big Ten is also getting rid of their divisional play. You're going to see some Michigan-Ohio State rematches, and I don't know about how you guys feel about it. I'm not a big fan of the rematches. I know we just saw one with Georgia and Alabama recently in the playoff. I don't like to see those rematches. I like to see the games, fresh opponents in the SEC title game. I do wonder if that means that Alabama-Georgia might be played earlier in the season than later in 2024.
So final question for me, and maybe the answer to this is obvious, maybe it's not. Is Georgia's 2024 schedule tougher than a normal SEC schedule?
Than a normal Georgia SEC schedule?
It's much tougher than a normal Georgia schedule because Georgia's had Vanderbilt, Missouri every year. Now they don't. Is it tougher than a normal SEC schedule?
I would say then, if you gave them Texas A&M's 2023 schedule, where you're getting, I believe, Florida from the East, and you're getting obviously South Carolina because they play them annually. I'd say it's probably pretty comparable to maybe not in Alabama, but like an LSU or a Texas A&M level schedule.
Yeah, like what Auburn typically does, playing the entirety of the SEC West plus Georgia. That's a pretty. Listen, I don't like Auburn, but that's a pretty tough schedule year in year, right? So we knew that Georgia was going to start playing more tougher games because the league was adding 2 teams, and you'd be playing more teams in the SEC West regularly. So from that standpoint, Mike, while it's fun to kind of hear these names of teams mentioned, on balance, I don't think this is necessarily tougher than what I sort of think of as the average SEC schedule necessarily.
Well, let's just remember that Georgia's last 2 regular season losses came against East teams. They came against South Carolina at home and against Florida and what was supposed to be a home game, but it's played in Jacksonville every year. They did lose in regular season, Connor. They did lose to Alabama in the SEC championship game.
They lost in the regular season to Bama in 20. It was 41-24.
Okay, 2 of the last 3 were against – well, that was on the road as well. So
pandemic doesn't count. Doesn't matter anyway.
The point is, I don't think that the East has been that much worse, especially when you look at what Tennessee was able to do last year to LSU and Alabama. When you look at South Carolina beating Clemson and Tennessee, I think the East has gotten more competitive. Certainly the Missouri game looked very competitive against Georgia to me, and Kentucky has done some nice things as well. I don't think they're great, but A&M hasn't been what we thought they were. Ole Miss finished last year on a slide, and Arkansas and Sam Pittman just can't seem to catch a break. So while on the one hand, I would agree that this does seem tougher than usual, I'm going to stand up for the SEC East here a little bit and say that I think it's been a little bit tougher than maybe people give it credit for being the last couple of years. In fact, I'm pretty sure the East had a winning record against the West last year.
All right. So any final thoughts here before we get ready to wrap up?
Georgia's probably not going undefeated in 2024, just given that schedule and the teams are going to play on an annual basis, and they're going to be just fine. It's going to be, I think, harder to be great week in, week out. And I'll say this, I do think that if you let Kirby Smart craft his schedule, he'd rather play Alabama 12 times than play Kentucky 12 times per se. I think it's, especially with a program like Georgia, it's just naturally easier to get up for big games, and Georgia going forward at Alabama, at Texas certainly qualify as that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key here is you want to be one of the two best teams in the SEC in 2024. I'm not ready to concede anything from this schedule for Georgia as of yet, but the job here is to
I
be
got one for you, BA. How many, now that you've seen the schedules, do we still think that 3, if not 4 SEC teams get in the college football playoff?
Well, I've never felt 4, but the point that you're getting to is kind of what I'm getting to there as well, is that third team is still a little bit of a mystery. This is where I kind of agree with Alabama Athletic Director Greg Byrne, who said, we don't have enough information right now to make a vote to go to 9. I do think they want to see how the College Football Playoff Selection Committee treats this third team from the SEC, who is going to have some losses. Those losses likely to come against good teams. The only thing year to year the CFP committee's ever consistently done is they reward teams who avoid losses. If you got a 0 or a 1 in the loss column, and you're from a Power 5 conference, the CFP committee typically likes that no matter who you play. They give a lot of lip service to, we like tough games and you know, we like teams to earn it. But the truth is what they really like are Power 5 teams to go undefeated. If not undefeated, to have 1 loss. And so I do think there is reason to have some skepticism about how the CFP committee is going to treat that third best team in the SEC, because it is going to have more losses than we're used to seeing a playoff team typically have, Mike. I think that's a very fair question.
No, and I agree with you. It's something that Hugh Freeze asked at media days about the schedule. He said, could Auburn get in with 3 losses if 2 of the losses were to Alabama and Georgia? I think that's a good point. It'll be interesting to also see how the Big 12 scrambles. You know, they're going to be remade right now. I saw they're trying to pitch that having Cincinnati bring some, you know, excitement to their league. I mean, boy, that's desperation. And what's left of the Pac-12 now without USC and UCLA? I mean, these are things that have to be taken into consideration. And where's the ACC by then? Can Florida State and Clemson sustain, even though they're getting tens of millions of dollars less with their television packages? There's a lot of unanswered questions. And to your point, Brandon and Connor, you said the same thing. We really don't know what the table's going to look like and how the cards are going to be dealt in 2024.
I'm looking forward to seeing what Georgia fans continue to say about this, seeing some complaints about kind of a lackluster home schedule. You know, there's a little bit of stuff out there about the idea that it's 2 straight trips to Alabama, although with a good space of years in between some of that. Well, I'll be curious to see how much steam builds around that. I don't see Georgia fans too hot right now, but I do see some complaining out there. I think it's going to take us a little while here to see some of those narratives fully form on some of that kind of stuff. But this is a fun conversation. I knew it would be a fun night. I love seeing this kind of stuff. We'll probably don't get a chance to do this maybe again because eventually they'll kind of establish something that's a little bit more permanent. But for this particular year, looking at 2024, I thought this was really, really fun. One last chance to say anything. You might want to do that.
But yeah, I think you should take us home.
I'm just going to say it just means more. It still means more.
Well, there you go. I think that's a great way to close it all out. So, hey, plenty of DawgNation. I'm sure Mike and Connor will be writing on this from every angle. I'll obviously talk to you about this tomorrow morning on DawgNation Daily. I did record an interview with Jake Fromm today. Jake's going to be on the show. We didn't know for sure that Georgia was playing Alabama and Texas. We had a pretty good idea, so we did talk about that. So you hear Jake Fromm's thoughts on this tomorrow on DawgNation Daily, along with Terrence Edwards there as well, who's always got plenty to say on all of this. And who knows, between now and the next time we speak, something big could have happened with UGA recruiting there as well, because that seems to be very much fashionable here at the moment. Either way.
4-star linebacker Joseph Phillips set to announce his commitment at 1 p.m. tomorrow. Be on the radar for that.
Yeah, there you go. That is certainly one to watch there. Out of Booker T in Alabama, is that right? Booker T, Washington, Alabama? Yeah, good program there in the state of Alabama. So there you go on all of that. We will talk to you soon, I'm sure. And thanks for being close here to DawgNation. Have a great night, everybody.